Hi everybody, Steve here again on Mr. Chuffy84. I hope you're all keeping well. I hope you're having a good weekend, whatever you're doing. Today I'm going to do a music review for you today. Not an album review, but a combined album review. Because today, after listening to the discography of Thin Lizzy during the past few weeks during this lockdown period, I thought to myself, what a good idea to do a whole video on the majority of the Thin Lizzy discography. Not the early era with Eric Bell on guitar, so those first three albums, Thin Lizzy, Shades of a Blue Orphanage and Vagabonds of the Western World. I haven't got those albums, so I'm not going to include those. I'm going to go from the Nightlife album from 1974, which is the first album to feature that classic lineup of Phil Lynott, Brian Downey, Scott Gorham and Brian Robertson. So from there, right up to 1983, which was their last album, Thunder and Lightning. So that's what I'm going to do today. And I've really enjoyed, over the last few weeks during this lockdown, checking out all the albums again. There were two albums in that period, that 9-year period, which I hadn't got, and I'll explain why later. So I was able to order those, get those in the post, and check those out just before this review. So this is why I'm now able to do this combined review for you. So how did I get into Thin Lizzy? Well, when I was younger, about, 10, 11, 12 years old, I used to go to my uncle and aunties quite regularly, and my uncle very graciously let me have access to his record collection, and so he invited me to look through his albums and his 7-inch singles, and I could play them on his hi-fi, which was really, really good of him. And one of the albums that he had in his collection was Thin Lizzy's Live and Dangerous, perhaps one of the greatest live albums of all time. A very controversial live album too, as everybody knows. Everybody knows the controversy behind it. How much is it? How much of it is live, and how much of it is overdubbed? I'm not going to go into that because I don't really care. It doesn't matter. It's still a great album, featuring recordings of their legendary tracks from Nightlife through to the Bad Reputation album, which was the new album at the time that Live and Dangerous was recorded. And of course, this is where Lizzy, of course, excelled. They were one of the best live bands, and so of course, the record company wants to get their live sound on album, and it sounds awesome. They sounded good in the studio, but they're at their best. They always sounded best live. Absolutely. Some wonderful tracks on this. This is the deluxe edition, which all the albums were reissued back in 2010 as deluxe editions. So you have the full album on disc 1, and then disc 2 would be either live tracks, or there would be demo tracks, or other recordings, or unreleased material. The whole of Live and Dangerous for this is spread across 2 discs because it was a double album. And then there's a third disc, which is a DVD, because they did shoot an hour-long film of one of the gigs from this tour. While we're checking out, there are a couple of bonus tracks, a couple of songs recorded for Live and Dangerous that didn't make it onto the album. Opium Trail, which is from Bad Reputation. Whatever reason, I don't know why that didn't get included, but they just didn't feel it was. They didn't want to include it. And the other is Bad Reputation itself. But the reason why that was jettisoned is because Bad Reputation features a very similar drum solo by Brian Downey. Virtually here's the same kind of drum solo he does on Shalala, which is on the album itself. So it makes sense. You could either have one or the other. You can't have both tracks on the album because Brian Downey does the same kind of drum solo in each track. So one of them had to go, and they chose Shalala over Bad Reputation. So that's worth checking out for that as well, and the sound's brilliant on that as well. So I heard a couple of tracks from Live and Dangerous when I was about 10 or 11. Rosalie was one, and Are You Ready was the other, and they just blew me away. And of course, The Boys Are Back in Town. I heard the original version of The Boys Are Back in Town on one of his singles, on one of my uncle's singles, and I thought, wow, this is fantastic. So, a long time after that, when I started working, I then looked out for some more Thin Lizzy albums, and then much later, in 2010, the reissues of the albums came out. So I thought, great, I'm going to look into getting the albums. So what I'm going to do in this review now then is I'm going to go through the albums in order, and but I'm not going to do like so from worst to best, you know. I'm not going to do that because there's already another gentleman on YouTube, Pete Pardo, I think his name is. He has already done his own worst to best of the Lizzy catalogue. So I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to go through them in chronological order, not the Eric Bell albums. We've already covered Live and Dangerous, which is absolutely brilliant, which turned me into a fan of the band. So I'm going to go into looking at the albums now from 1974 with the classic lineup onwards. So we start, ladies and gentlemen, with Nightlife from 1974, and as you can see, the lineup, the famous lineup. I don't even see there. There you go. So Brian Robertson on guitar, the man, of course, Phil Lynott on bass and vocals, Brian Downey on drums, and Scott Gorham on lead guitar as well. Now, I actually heard this album. This is actually one of the albums which I hadn't got on CD until just a few weeks ago. And there was a reason for that. I got this album a good number of years ago, after Live and Dangerous. I got it on cassette tape. I got Nightlife on cassette. And this was the album, this album very much bridged, that was very much bridged the Eric Bell era to the classic rock era. And on this album, Phil was still trying to find his way. It's a very subdued album. I was expecting everything Lizzy album to be full on hard rock. Not so with Nightlife. It is a much more sort of calm, very relaxed kind of album. There are a couple of good rockers on this album, but there are other tracks which are far more in its production and its performance, a bit more subdued. But you have a couple of great songs on this album. Showdown, you have Shalala, which I mentioned from Live and Dangerous, and It's Only Money, which is a really good rocker. That is really, really good. Other highlights for this album for me, She Knows, which is the opening track. I like that track too. And there are songs on, this is the only Lizzy album that I know that, well, certainly of this era, that incorporates orchestral parts and strings parts. Very unusual for Lizzy. So we're talking such as songs like Frankie Carroll and Dear Heart. It's not a bad album. It's not bad. It's not their best. But, and as I say, it was, they hadn't quite, even though they now had the two guitarists, you would expect it to be heavier. It's not a heavy album at all. And they hadn't really, as that four-piece, they were still finding their way. But it's well worth checking out. The other highlight on this album is Still in Love with You. Now, on the album version, on this original album version, Phil Lynott sings the song as a duet with Frankie Miller, who I don't know. I don't know anything about Frankie Miller. And Frankie actually co-wrote the song with Phil. But I have to say, it's a nice version, but it's nothing compared to the version that is on Live and Dangerous. Still in Love with You is one of the highlights of Live and Dangerous. Phil sings it on his own, and it's just so much better. It's just better performed, better recorded. But that is one of the classic songs. The original version is one of the well-known ones from Nightlife. So that's Nightlife. Not one of the best albums. It's not a bad album, but not one of my favourites. So that's from 74. Going on to 75. Fighting. Now this is where they really came into their fore. This is their second album in this lineup, and this was the rock the really rocking Thin Lizzy that I'm sure everyone was getting really excited about come this time. This is where they started to find their sound, and with that trademark twin lead guitar parts as well on tracks like Wild One, with the twin lead guitar riffs and harmonies as well. It sounds awesome, absolutely awesome. Rosalie is on here, opening the album. There's some good tracks on this one. Suicide has always been a good track for me. That's a great track. And a favourite song of mine on this one is Ballad of a Hard Man. Now, this one was actually a rare one in the sense that this was not a Phil Lynott composition. It's Scott Gorham who wrote Ballad of a Hard Man. Very interesting in its time signatures as well. The main riff is in 5/4 time, so 5 beats to a bar, and then the chorusy bit goes back to 4 beats in the bar, the standard 4 beats in the bar. So it goes from 5/4 to 4/4 and then back again. But that is a fantastic rocker. And as I say, unusual because it's not one of Phil's own songs. Phil wrote the majority of songs for Thin Lizzy, or would co-write them with other people. But yeah, Scott Gorham wrote that one. It closes the album and it's a great closer. Again, this is another deluxe edition from 2010 with various demo tracks with alternate versions and ones with just instrumental versions of songs on the second disc there, and a B-side as well. But this was where they were starting to find their sound that they would become well known for. So that's Fighting from 1975. Then we come to 76. By this time, Vertigo, which is their record label, said to the guys, "Look, guys, we've not had any hit singles from Nightlife and Fighting. There were no real big hit singles from those 2 albums. We need you now to go and deliver us not only a great album, but we need." Not saying that those 2 albums weren't great. Fighting is a good album. But we need an album that is outstanding, and we need hit singles. If you can't do it for us, then that's it. It's over. It's over. We're going to drop you from the label. That was from Vertigo. So from 1976, what did they do? The response to that was Jailbreak. And this album, of course, is perhaps the most celebrated Thin Lizzy studio album. And it was the first studio album that I got, and I got it on vinyl before I got it on the deluxe edition. As you can see there. This album is fantastic. It's superb from start to finish. I would say the only track of the 9 tracks on this album, and of course you're going to recognise some of these, I'm sure. Jailbreak, the title track. Angel from the Coast, Running Back, Romeo and the Lonely Girl, Warriors, The Boys Are Back in Town, Final Fall, Cowboy Song, and Emerald. So you have got Jailbreak, Boys Are Back in Town, Emerald, Cowboy Song. Those 4 are instant classic Lizzy songs. That's what the record label was looking for, and their audiences responded really, really well to them. Cowboy Song was a big live favourite. Boys Are Back in Town, of course, is the ultimate Lizzy anthem. Jailbreak is awesome as well, of course, and Emerald, which is of course Phil Lynott, being an Irishman, that was one of the most important thing for Phil, is that he would delve into some of his writing. He would go back to his Irish roots for some of his songs. Philomena from Nightlife is written about his mother, and Emerald, a lot of Irish roots in that, of course, as well. The only track for me that is, I would consider to be the weakest, I would say, although it's not a bad song, it's just not the best song, and that's Angel from the Coast, which is one that Phil wrote with Brian Robertson. It's a good song, but it's not one of their best. But the rest of the album is fantastic. And one of the most brilliant things is on this bonus disc are some of the remixes that they did for this. Scott Gorham and Brian Downey, about the same year that these were for these reissues, they went back into the studio to go back to the master tapes and to do some remixes of some of the songs, and they remixed Jailbreak, and they added some extra parts on as well. They actually went into the studio and recorded a few extra guitar bits for it, and they found an old intro, a Phil Lynott spoken intro to Jailbreak, with him speaking through a megaphone, which they didn't put on the original version, but they've added it to the beginning of the remix, and it sounds unbelievable. It sounds awesome. So unfortunately, these deluxe issues, which I say were released in 2010, you can't get them very easily now, 10 years on. I looked on Amazon, and you're asking crazy money now to get second-hand copies for these. So I was very fortunate to get, and they were like a tenner a piece for a double album, which was brilliant value when they first came out. But Jailbreak is awesome, absolutely brilliant, absolutely, hands down for me. I think it's got to be one of the best, if not the best, studio album by Thin Lizzy. Then we move on to Johnny the Fox. From 1976, I believe. The follow-up to Jailbreak, always going to be a tough one. Always going to be tough. It was conceived as a concept album by Phil Lynott, concentrating on two particular characters, Rocky the rock star and Johnny, who's a very sort of streetwise kind of cat. But I had no idea. It was a concept album that didn't really work completely, but you do have those first two songs focusing on those two characters, Johnny, then Rocky, but you have some great songs on here, such as Don't Believe a Word, which obviously has been one of Lizzy's greatest hits, and Johnny the Fox meets Jimmy the Weed, that really funky streetwise track, absolutely amazing track. And there are some other good tracks on here. Massacre's good. Sweet Marie is a nice ballad. I really like that. It's good. But you've got other songs on here that I don't think rank them on the very, very finest. Phil actually wrote the majority of this material while he was recovering from hepatitis. He was in hospital after the Jailbreak tour, and while he was recovering, he sat and he wrote the material for Johnny the Fox. It's not their greatest album, I have to say. It's not a bad follow-up, but there are some, listening to it again, there are some, apart from the really well-known stuff, there's some good stuff on here, but it doesn't rank among one of my favourites. Then 77, this is the album, of course, before Live and Dangerous, Bad Reputation. And don't worry about my cough, folks. It's not anything to do with the virus. So Bad Reputation, 1977. Tony Visconti, the producer, came in. The famous producer, worked with Iggy Pop and David Bowie. Went on now to work with Thin Lizzy. And Brian Robertson, for the majority, was out of the band because of the fact that he had a fight with somebody, I think, and his behaviour was getting a bit more erratic, so that's why he's not on the album cover. But you've got some great tracks on here, wonderful stuff. Dancing in the Moonlight, what a track with the saxophone, absolutely brilliant, that saxophone lick, and guitar licks as well, unbelievable, great track. Bad Reputation is becoming itself, the title track, becoming one of my favourite Lizzy songs of all. What an amazing song, brilliant rocker, and it proves as well what an underrated drummer Brian Downey was and is. Brian Downey was an awesome drummer. Everyone focused on Phil Lynott on vocals and bass, and everybody really admired the guitar work of Brian Robertson, and Scott Gorham. But Brian Downey as a drummer, no one really talked much about Brian, but one awesome drummer Brian Downey is. When you listen to his drum parts and how he drums on these albums, is unbelievable. is fantastic. There are some other great songs as well on this album for me. Killer Without a Cause is another good rocker. That Woman's Gonna Break Your Heart is excellent as well. Really like that song. There are, on the flip side, a few songs, even though it was a very successful album for Lizzy, there are a couple of songs that perhaps aren't the best. Soldier of Fortune is not a great opener. I'm not a big fan of that song. I don't know why. It doesn't really work for me. Opium Trail's on here, which is good. Downtown Sundown, which even in the notes says was not one of Phil's finest moments as a songwriter, and it's not a great song. It's not brilliant, but that's on there as well. Southbound, which is on here, also in Live and Dangerous. That's a good song as well. So overall, a good album, a really strong album, and it sold well. It did very, very well. Of course, perhaps their best produced album because of it being with Tony Visconti as producer. Dear Lord, which is the last track, is an unusual one. It has a very ethereal, angel-like sort of vocal that's on there, provided by Mary Hopkin of Those Were the Days fame. You remember Mary Hopkin? The most unlikeliest singer to ever appear on a Thin Lizzy album. But she did those wonderful angelic vocals for Dear Lord. And the reason why Mary Hopkin is because she was married at the time to Tony Visconti. So that's how she got involved. So that's Bad Reputation. After that came Live and Dangerous. And then after Live and Dangerous, Brian Robertson was out of the band completely. He was gone and replaced by Gary Moore, the legendary blues guitarist, much missed blues guitarist Gary Moore, who had actually appeared on Still in Love with You on Nightlife, because before Brian Robertson and Scott Gorham came along, after Eric Bell had left, Gary Moore came in and filled in for a little while before Brian and Scott joined the band. Then Gary left, obviously, and then he came back to the band in 1979 for Black Rose, which I have a soft spot for this album. Obviously, I think this was actually the highest charting Lizzy album, studio album that is, and there's some wonderful material on here again, deluxe edition. Really, really pleased with that. What have we got with here? Waiting for an Alibi, yes, another good track, another Lizzy classic, along with Do Anything You Want To, which is a great opener. You've got some really good stuff on here. Toughest Street in Town is good. Sarah is a lovely track, an unusual track for Lizzy. it's a ballad from Phil Bates, beautifully played, written in honour of his daughter. It's a beautiful song, really gorgeous song. And then of course the big track on this album, which is Black Rose itself, which is a medley of traditional Irish songs, Shenandoah, Danny Boy, and all incorporated into this big 7-minute piece that Phil and the guys wrote. And it's superb. It's absolutely brilliant. There are also a couple of interesting ones on here. S&M being one. Yeah. Only Phil Lynott could write that. Because that was Phil. The lifestyle. You think everybody says it. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That was Phil Lynott in a nutshell. So there you go. And then Got to Give It Up, which addresses his issues with his drug taking for the first time as well. And in the first part of that song, you can hear how his vocal, his singing voice is affected by the drugs that he's taking, which would be evident much later on as well on the other albums. So there we go. So that's Black Rose, the only album featuring Gary Moore on twin lead guitar with Scott Gorham. Then going into the 1980s, Chinatown from 1980. Out goes Gary Moore again, and in comes a guitarist that would get a lot of flack from the fans, Snowy White, who really wasn't a rock guitarist at all. He was like Gary Moore, he was a blues guitarist, but Gary was a great blues player, but he was a great rock player as well. Snowy White, though, you can see who's here. Snowy was a blues guitarist, first and foremost. He wasn't really a rocker. So he wasn't really suited for Thin Lizzy. He did his best. He really wants to give it a go. He played with Pink Floyd before joining Lizzy. But he joined the guys for 2 albums. The first being Chinatown. It's not a bad album, but this is where Lizzy was starting to go a little downhill. Mainly because of the fact that Phil Lynott and Scott Gorham were really heavily into their drug habits, heroin, cocaine, and it was affecting them as people, and it was affecting Phil's abilities as a songwriter as well. There's still some good material on Chinatown. The title track is awesome. I've always loved Chinatown as a song. Having a Good Time is good as well. We Will Be Strong is fine. Killer on the Loose, pretty controversial track because of its subject matter, the Jack the Ripper and all that kind of stuff. That was a bit controversial, but it's a good song nonetheless. Genocide is another good one, but there are some weak songs on here as well. The last 2 tracks especially, Didn't I and Hey You, are not great songs for me. And neither is Sugar Blues either. It's okay, but it's not one of their best. So there's some good material on here, but some not so good material either. So well worth a look, well worth a listen, but not not amazing, shall we say. Then the album considered to be the worst. So Lizzy had been going up and up and up and up throughout the 70s. Now into the 80s they were going down and down and down. Chinatown being the start of that, then even going down even further was 1981's Renegade. I'd heard so many bad reviews about this album and saying, the songwriting was poor and everybody, the band's falling apart and all that kind of stuff. So I went into this album with very, very low expectations, and I'll tell you this, I listened to it and I was pleasantly surprised by actually quite how decent it was. It was still a very decently recorded album, and the majority of the material on this album, especially in the first half, is actually very strong. Angel of Death has got to be not the heaviest as such, but it's certainly heavy, one of the darkest songs, if not the darkest song that Lizzy ever recorded. The lyrics and the subject matter is very, very dark. So certainly the darkest, but it has an incredible keyboard intro to it. They employed Darren Warson on keyboards just to provide a little extra texture to some of the songs, and he co-wrote Angel of Death with Phil. And yeah, my goodness me, very, very dark. But the rest of it, the Renegade, the title track, is okay. It's not a bad song. It's a song that grew on me. The Pressure Will Blow and Leave This Town, I think, are good songs as well. Hollywood, which was co-written by Scott Gorham, is an excellent song. I really like that song. So that's good. No One Told Him and Fats are also good songs for me. They're really, decent songs. Mexican Blood is not great, I have to say. I think lyrically it's one of the weakest lyrics that Phil's written. And It's Getting Dangerous, which is another Scott Gorham, Phil Lynott track. Not a great closer either, I have to say. So, a mixed album again, but it is mostly decent. The most evident thing, though, most definitely, is Phil's vocal. His singing on this album is quite rough in patches. His voice is shot at times because of the drugs that he was taking. He was, doing so many drugs that it was affecting his vocal cords and his voice, and it's evident on this album. Not all the tracks, but on some of the tracks, just how rough his voice actually is and how gravelly it is and raspy it is. And I was amazed by just how bad it was at times. But as an album, it is well worth checking out. Please don't ignore this album because people say it's their worst album. This is a decent album to check out, and I still enjoy hearing it today. Then we come, ladies and gentlemen, to the final album from 1983, and this is Thunder and Lightning. So, got a bit of a glare on that. This is actually a single edition. This is actually, along with Nightlife, this is the album that I've only just heard. I heard it twice recently. Only just got it the other week. I knew the title track pretty well before going into this album, and The Sun Goes Down I knew as well. So, out goes Snowy White. He had had enough. Snow White had had enough. He'd been with them for 2 albums. Didn't like the experience very, very much, especially in the studio. And he was out. And in comes, to replace Snowy White, comes in John Sykes, who would, after this album, the year after this album, would go on and join Whitesnake. So, Thunder and Lightning, the title track is the heaviest track I think that Lizzy have ever done. Really, it's heavy rock, going almost verging on metal perhaps as well. But it's very, very heavy rock. Perhaps a little too heavy, but there you go. You've got some interesting stuff on this album. I'm not going to say this isn't my favourite Lizzy album, but on second listen just the other day, some of the songs are really, really decent. But again, Phil's voice is still quite raspy at times because of the drugs, quite rough. So his voice was past its best. His singing voice now was way, way past its best. Cold Sweat is another good rocker, really good rock. It's the only song that John Sykes had any involvement in writing. He co-wrote it with Phil. There are a couple of songs on here which are really interesting musically. Phil's songs, his style of writing, the kind of chord sequences he uses, became quite similar over the songs. Whereas with songs like Someday She's Going to Hit Back and Heart Attack, Phil wrote those with Brian Downey or with Scott Gorham and with Darren Wharton on keyboards. And they have different kind of chord sequences and chord modulations. They make them just that little bit different to a normal Lizzy track, if you know what I mean. And they sound really, really interesting. So that was good. This Is the One is a good track as well. Again, Darren Wharton co-wrote that with Lynette, as he did with The Sun Goes Down. Hands down, the best song on this album. A brilliant, brilliant song. Absolutely brilliant. The best song, probably, of the 80s from Thin Lizzy. Absolutely amazing track. A wonderful, really slow number, a slow kind of rock ballad, soft rock ballad if you like, which is unbelievable. So, and then by this time, Phil and Scott were really struggling with their drug habits. Scott just couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't take it anymore. And so he left Thin Lizzy after this album in order to get himself recovered from his drug and to kick his drug habit. Whereas unfortunately, Phil just couldn't do it. He could not kick his habit. And very sadly, he died 3 years later in January of 1986. So that was the final album from Thin Lizzy. There was another live album that followed this one, the Life Live album from 1983, which I haven't yet got. I will get it at some point. But the studio albums, that was the last one. So there we go, ladies and gentlemen. That's my celebration of the Thin Lizzy studio catalogue. If you don't know Lizzy so well, or if you now, after hearing my reviews of those albums, if you want to get... if you want to hear more of Lizzy, you think to yourself, oh, I'd like to check out a bit of Lizzy, where do I start? Jailbreak most definitely is perhaps my favourite. I think it is definitely the best and my favourite of the studio albums, so well worth checking out. But if you're thinking, well, I haven't got any Lizzy in my catalogue, but I actually quite fancy checking it out now, where do I go? I would say on the studio albums, I'd go with Jailbreak first. There are greatest hits albums. There's the greatest hits album that came out in 2007, 13 years ago. This is a double album. the very best of Thin Lizzy, plus a couple of solo tracks from Phil as well, because Phil also recorded a couple of solo albums. So there we go. So if you want a best of Lizzy, this I'm sure is still available on Amazon. But in your local supermarkets and in your music stores, if you want a really good budget label Thin Lizzy best of to check out, I would go with this one, Waiting for an Alibi, Thin Lizzy The Collection, which is released from Spectrum Records, which is a subsidiary, I think, of Universal. Spectrum are the budget label compilation, who do budget priced compilations, so you can get Waiting for an Alibi in some places for like £3 brand new, or even a £5 at best. So that has got 20 tracks on here representing the best of Thin Lizzy from the early eras right through to the latter period. So well worth checking out if you want to. So as I say, a budget price best of album, that's one to go with. If you want to delve even further and you want to have a look at Phil's solo work, Spectrum also put out a compilation of Phil's solo work, which is Yellow Pearl, a collection. So the majority of his two solo albums are on here. And if you think to yourself, oh, it's going to be a bit more of the same, a bit like Lizzy, you would be wrong. There are a couple of Lizzy sounding stuff on here, but Phil's solo material is, in a lot of areas, quite different to Thin Lizzy. So if you're expecting Phil's solo work to be just like Thin Lizzy's work, you will be very surprised to hear that it isn't. But there are some good songs on there to check out too. So there we are, folks. That's it. That's my little roundup of all the Lizzy catalogue, except for the early stuff with Eric Bell on guitar. Hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoy discovering these albums, or at least the best of if you want to get started. Okay, thank you guys. I will see you again soon. Have a good week, and I'll be back soon for some more movie reviews and some more album reviews. If you are already a user on YouTube, please do subscribe to my channel, and as I say, I'll look forward to seeing you soon. Take care for now. Bye bye.